The early morning sun crept over the horizon, casting a golden glow over the small village of Meadowbrook. Its narrow cobblestone streets were still damp with dew, and the gentle hum of daily life began to stir. At the farthest edge of the village, in a modest wooden house patched with care, young Ethan was already awake. Barefoot and wearing a hand-me-down shirt, slightly too big for his thin frame, he crouched over a small wooden box, carefully organizing the few coins he had earned the previous week. "Ethan, breakfast is ready," called Grace, his mother, her voice warm but weary. She stood in the tiny kitchen, a room that also served as a dining area and a workspace for her sewing. Grace's hands bore the marks of years spent stitching clothes for the wealthier villagers. Though her face was lined with the trials of life, her eyes remained kind and steady, reflecting the strength of a woman who had weathered storms most could not fathom. Ethan bounded into the room, followed closely by his younger sister, Molly. At 8 years old, Molly was the family's spark of joy. She brought light to the dimmest days with her infectious giggle and boundless curiosity. The three of them gathered around a small wooden table to share a simple meal of porridge and bread. After breakfast, Ethan slipped out the door, his bag slung over one shoulder. He had promised to help Mr. Henry, the baker, deliver loaves to the villagers. The arrangement brought in a few extra coins, which Ethan saved for emergencies or for the rare treat for Molly. As he made his way to the bakery, he greeted neighbors with a polite nod, dodging the wagging finger of old Mrs. Doris, the village's unofficial gossip. "Mark my words, that boy's too curious for his own good," Doris muttered to no one in particular. Ethan had learned to ignore her, focusing instead on the smiles of those who appreciated his cheerful demeanor and willingness to help. By mid-morning, Ethan had completed his deliveries and pocketed a few coins from grateful customers. On his way back home, he decided to take a detour through the meadows. It was his favorite part of the village, a stretch of green fields dotted with wildflowers that seemed to go on forever. As he walked, kicking a stray pebble along the path, something caught his eye. There, lying slightly off the trail, was a worn leather wallet. Ethan crouched to pick it up, turning it over in his hands. It was heavier than he expected, and when he opened it, his heart skipped a beat. Inside was a thick stack of bills, neatly folded, along with a few documents and cards. For a moment, Ethan just stared. His mind raced with possibilities. The money could pay for the shoes Molly desperately needed. It could buy extra food for the pantry or even settle the mounting rent his mother struggled to pay. But then he thought of Grace, her teachings about honesty, about doing what was right no matter how hard it seemed. His hands trembled as he closed the wallet. The decision loomed like a heavy cloud over his head. What should he do? Ethan slipped the wallet into his bag and continued walking, though the path now felt unfamiliar under his feet. The cheerful birdsong and rustling leaves no longer filled him with comfort. Instead, the weight of the wallet seemed to press down on him, challenging everything he thought he knew about himself. By the time he reached home, the sun had begun its slow descent. He paused at the gate, looking at the small house where his family waited. The thought of their tired smiles gave him pause. He tightened his grip on the bag. What if... "Ethan, you're late," Grace called from the doorway, her brow furrowing. But as her son stepped into the yard, she could see something different in his expression, a quiet turmoil that hadn't been there before. Ethan gave a weak smile, brushing off her concern. "Just lost track of time," he mumbled. As he sat down at the table that evening, the wallet remained in his bag, its presence undeniable. Ethan glanced at Molly, who was humming softly while braiding a doll's hair. His mother, busy sewing under the dim light of a single lamp, didn't notice the conflicted look on her son's face. That night, as Ethan lay in his small bed, he stared at the ceiling, sleep eluding him. The wallet felt like a boulder in his mind, pulling him into deeper waters. He clung to his mother's voice in his memory. Doing the right thing isn't always easy, Ethan, but it's what makes us who we are. His decision would have to come soon, but for now, it lingered, heavy and unresolved. The morning sun filtered through the thin curtains of Ethan's small room, painting golden streaks across the faded walls. He sat on the edge of his bed, the worn leather wallet resting heavily in his hands. He hadn't slept much. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw Molly's laughter, his mother's tired hands, and the creased bills inside the wallet. "Ethan!" Grace's voice called from the kitchen. "Come help me with the laundry before you head out." Her tone was firm, but not unkind. She always made sure Ethan understood the value of responsibility, even in their modest home. Sliding the wallet into his bag once more, Ethan joined his mother in the yard, where a clothesline sagged under the weight of freshly washed linens. Molly was playing nearby, arranging wildflowers into a messy crown for her doll. Grace studied her son as he worked. "You seem quiet this morning," she said, handing him a damp sheet to hang. "Everything all right?" Ethan hesitated, his hands fumbling with the clothespins. "Yeah, just tired," he mumbled. He didn't meet her eyes, afraid she might somehow see the secret he was carrying. As soon as his chores were done, Ethan grabbed his bag and made his way toward the village square. Each step felt heavier than the last. His usual route took him past the bakery, the church, and the small market where villagers bartered goods. Today, the bustle of the square seemed louder, the chatter more intrusive, as if the world itself was pressuring him to make a choice. He paused by the fountain, its steady trickle a rare constant in his life. Reaching into his bag, he pulled out the wallet again, flipping through its contents. The crisp bills stared back at him, silent yet accusing. Among the money were cards bearing the name George Wellington, a name he'd only heard in passing. Mr. Wellington was rumored to be a wealthy businessman who owned the grand mansion on the hill, a place so removed from village life it might as well have been a castle in a storybook. Ethan's heart raced as he thought about climbing that hill, knocking on that imposing door, and facing whoever might answer. What would they say? Would they think he was lying? Would they even care? His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps. It was old Mrs. Doris clutching a basket of apples. Her sharp eyes landed on Ethan, her curiosity piqued by his troubled expression. "What's got you looking so serious, boy?" she asked, peering into his bag. Ethan instinctively pulled it closer, his face flushing. "Nothing, ma'am," he replied quickly, forcing a polite smile. Doris narrowed her eyes. "You'd best keep your nose clean, Ethan. Folks talk, you know." With a huff, she shuffled away, leaving Ethan with a knot of unease tightening in his stomach. He decided to escape the busy square, heading toward the meadows for some solitude. As he walked, he thought of his mother's stories about integrity and the importance of always choosing the right path. But how could he know what was right when his family's needs were so great? Returning the wallet meant giving up a chance to ease their struggles. Keeping it, though, felt like a betrayal of everything his mother had taught him. By the time he reached the familiar fields of wildflowers, the weight of his decision had become unbearable. He sat down on a large rock, his bag beside him, and stared out at the horizon. The sky was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, but Ethan's thoughts were stormy. He pulled the wallet out one last time, his fingers brushing against a small photograph tucked behind the bills. It was a picture of a younger man, broad-shouldered and smiling, standing beside a sleek car. Ethan guessed it was George Wellington. The man's confident demeanor struck a stark contrast with Ethan's own humble existence. "Why did I have to find this?" Ethan whispered to himself. "Why couldn't someone else have picked it up?" The sound of Molly's laughter echoed faintly in his mind, reminding him of the joy she brought to their small family. He thought of his mother, tirelessly sewing late into the night, her back bent, her hands raw. This money could change everything. But then he heard her voice again, the lesson she had repeated so many times. The world tests us in ways we don't always understand. What matters is how we answer. Ethan sighed deeply, slipping the wallet back into his bag. The decision was far from made, but for now, he knew he couldn't act in haste. He needed more time, and perhaps even courage, to do what he felt was right. As he walked home, the wallet pressed against his side like a silent reminder of the path he still had to choose. The next morning, Ethan rose with a resolve he hadn't felt the day before. The wallet lay on his nightstand, its presence as heavy as a stone. His decision wasn't final, but he knew he couldn't keep avoiding it. He had to figure out who George Wellington was and how to return what belonged to him. After a quick breakfast, Ethan slipped the wallet into his bag and announced his plans to his mother. "I'll be back by lunch," he said casually. Grace didn't press him for details, busy hemming a dress for one of the village shopkeepers. Molly waved at him cheerfully, too preoccupied with her doll to notice the tension in his voice. Ethan's first stop was the market square, where he approached Mr. Thomashill, the village's aging postman. Mr. Thomas was known for his sharp memory and knowledge of everyone in Meadowbrook and beyond. If anyone could point Ethan in the right direction, it was him. "Morning, Mr. Thomas," Ethan greeted, adjusting the strap of his bag nervously. The postman looked up from sorting letters and smiled. "Morning, lad." "What brings you here so early?" Ethan hesitated, pulling the wallet halfway out of his bag before tucking it back in. "I'm, looking for someone, a Mr. George Wellington. Do you know him?" Thomas scratched his chin thoughtfully. "Wellington, you say? That'd be the man up at the old mansion on the hill. Rarely comes to the village, wealthy sort, keeps to himself." Ethan nodded, the knot in his stomach tightening. "Do you know how I could reach him?" The postman chuckled. "Reach him? You'd have to climb that hill and knock on his door, but don't expect a warm welcome. His staff aren't fond of visitors." Thanking Mr. Thomas, Ethan wandered back toward the square, feeling a mix of relief and trepidation. At least he knew where to go. But the thought of approaching the grand mansion filled him with dread. He couldn't shake the image of being turned away at the gate, accused of stealing or worse, ignored completely. As he mulled over his options, he passed by the bakery where Mr. Henry, the baker, was arranging fresh loaves in the window. Spotting Ethan, he waved him inside. "Ethan, haven't seen you since the deliveries yesterday. Everything all right?" Ethan nodded, though his expression betrayed his uncertainty. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just trying to figure something out." Henry raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. Instead, he handed Ethan a small bun wrapped in paper. "Here, on the house. You look like you could use a bite." The simple gesture warmed Ethan's heart, even if it didn't ease his burden. As he left the bakery, bun in hand, he resolved to take the next step. But before heading to the mansion, he decided to ask around the village for more information. If George Wellington was as reclusive as Mr. Thomas said, perhaps others had stories to share. Stopping by the blacksmith shop, Ethan spoke with Mr. Cartwright, a burly man with a booming voice. "Wellington, rich fellow, isn't he?" Cartwright said, hammering away at a horseshoe. "Don't know much about him, though. Keeps to his own up there. Folks say he's got more money than sense." Ethan thanked him and moved on, but the pattern became clear. George Wellington was a mystery to most. The villagers seemed to view him with a mix of awe and suspicion, a man too wealthy and too distant to be part of their world. By midday, Ethan found himself at the edge of the hill leading to the mansion. The path was overgrown, winding steeply upward through a thicket of trees. He stared at it for a long moment, the weight of the wallet heavy against his side. He wanted to turn back, to push the responsibility onto someone else. But deep down, he knew this was something he had to do. Taking a deep breath, he began the climb. The path was rough, lined with roots and stones that snagged his worn shoes. The farther he went, the more imposing the mansion became. Its towering silhouette loomed over him, a stark contrast to the simple cottages in the village below. When he finally reached the top, Ethan found himself standing before a tall iron gate. Beyond it, the mansion stood in all its grandeur, its ivy-covered walls and sprawling gardens, a testament to wealth and isolation. For a moment, Ethan considered turning around. The thought of facing whoever lived inside filled him with doubt. But then he remembered his mother's words. "We're defined by what we choose to do when no one's watching." Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Ethan reached out and rang the bell beside the gate. The sound echoed through the still air, and he waited, heart pounding, for whatever might come next. The gate creaked open slowly, revealing a stern-looking woman dressed in a sharp black uniform. Her expression was unreadable, her graying hair pulled back into a bun that seemed as rigid as her demeanor. She studied Ethan from head to toe, her piercing gaze making him feel smaller than he already was. "What business do you have here?" she asked sharply, her voice clipped and formal. Ethan swallowed hard, suddenly questioning whether coming here had been the right decision. I found something that I think belongs to Mr. Wellington," he said, his voice steadier than he expected. The woman's brow furrowed as she opened the gate wider. "Wait here," she said, disappearing into the shadows of the grand mansion. Ethan shifted on his feet, glancing nervously at the towering stone structure ahead. It was unlike anything he had ever seen up close. Ornate carvings lined the walls, and tall windows sparkled in the sunlight. He imagined what it must be like to live surrounded by such splendor. Minutes passed, and just as Ethan began to wonder if he had been forgotten, the woman returned. "Follow me," she said curtly, holding the gate open. Ethan stepped through, his heart pounding in his chest as the gate clanged shut behind him. The mansion's interior was even grander than the outside suggested. The entry hall alone was larger than Ethan's entire house, with marble floors that gleamed under the light of a crystal chandelier. Paintings of stern-faced ancestors lined the walls, their gazes seeming to follow Ethan as he was led down a long corridor. The woman stopped in front of a heavy wooden door, knocking twice before pushing it open. "Master Wellington, the boy is here," she announced before stepping aside to let Ethan in. Inside, seated behind a massive oak desk, was a man who looked older than the photograph Ethan had found in the wallet, but carried the same air of confidence. George Wellington's silver hair was neatly combed, and his tailored suit fit him perfectly. He looked up from a stack of papers, his sharp blue eyes meeting Ethan's. "Well," Wellington said, his voice deep and commanding. "What is it?" Ethan hesitated, fumbling with his bag as he pulled out the wallet. "I found this on the road near the meadow," he said, stepping forward and placing it on the desk. "I thought it might be yours." Wellington raised an eyebrow, leaning forward to inspect the wallet. He opened it, his expression softening as he thumbed through the contents. "It is mine," he said quietly, though there was a hint of surprise in his tone. "And you brought it back to me?" "Yes, sir," Ethan replied, standing as straight as he could. "I thought it was the right thing to do." For a moment, Wellington said nothing, his eyes fixed on the wallet. Then he looked up, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Do you know how much money is in here, boy?" Ethan nodded, his cheeks flushing. "Yes, sir, I saw it." "And you weren't tempted to keep it?" Wellington asked, his voice calm but probing. Ethan shook his head firmly. "No, sir, my mom says that honesty is more important than anything." Wellington leaned back in his chair, studying Ethan as if trying to unravel a puzzle. "Your mother raised you well," he said at last. "Not many would have done the same." Ethan felt a rush of pride at the compliment, but it was quickly tempered by a sense of unease. There was something about Wellington's expression, a mixture of gratitude and something deeper, more wistful, that made Ethan wonder what the man was thinking. "Marjorie," Wellington called, and the woman who had brought Ethan in appeared almost instantly. "Prepare something for the boy to take home. It's the least I can do." Ethan opened his mouth to protest, but Wellington raised a hand to stop him. "You've done me a great service, and I insist on showing my gratitude. Now, tell me your name." "Ethan, sir. Ethan Miller." Wellington repeated the name softly, as though it meant something to him. "Well, Ethan Miller, I hope you know that your honesty is rare." "It's refreshing." Marjorie returned moments later with a small parcel wrapped in fine paper. Ethan accepted it reluctantly, thanking Wellington as he prepared to leave, but just as he reached the door, the millionaire spoke again. "Ethan," he said, his voice softer now, "if you ever need anything at all, don't hesitate to come back." Ethan nodded, though he wasn't sure what to make of the offer. As he stepped out into the sunlight, the weight on his shoulders began to lift, replaced by a strange mix of relief and curiosity. For now, his task was done. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was only the beginning. The walk back to the village felt longer than usual. Ethan's thoughts were a whirlwind as he clutched the parcel Mr. Wellington's housekeeper, Marjorie, had handed him. Wrapped in thick paper tied with a ribbon, it looked far too fine to be in his hands. Each step down the hill brought more questions than answers. Why had the wealthy man been so insistent on expressing his gratitude? And why had he said Ethan could come to him for anything? When Ethan reached home, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting the village in a warm amber glow. Grace was outside, sewing by the light, while Molly chased a butterfly near the fence. The sight of them filled Ethan with relief, grounding him after the strangeness of the day. "Ethan, you're late," Grace called, her voice tinged with both concern and curiosity. Her sharp eyes immediately fell on the parcel in his hands. "What's that?" "It's from..." Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to share. "I returned something to someone. They wanted to thank me." Grace put down her sewing, her brow furrowing. "Who? And what did you return?" Ethan sighed, sitting beside her on the wooden bench. He recounted the entire story, from finding the wallet to his trek up to the mansion on the hill. He described George Wellington in careful detail, the imposing figure, the grand house, and his curious offer of help. When he finished, Grace sat silently, her expression unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "You did the right thing, Ethan. But accepting anything from a man like George Wellington..." She trailed off, her voice heavy with something Ethan couldn't quite identify. "Why?" Ethan asked. His curiosity piqued. "What's wrong with him?" "Nothing, necessarily," Grace said carefully. "But people like him don't usually understand what it's like to be like us. Sometimes their generosity comes with strings attached." Ethan frowned, but didn't argue. Instead, he set the parcel on the bench and untied the ribbon. Inside were a small loaf of fine bread, a jar of honey, and a crisp envelope with Ethan's name on it. Grace's breath caught as Ethan handed her the envelope, sensing its significance. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling slightly. Inside was a note written in elegant script. "Ethan, thank you for your honesty. In a world where integrity is rare, you've reminded me of its value. Please accept this token of appreciation and remember that my door is always open to you and your family. With gratitude, George Wellington." Grace stared at the note for a long time, her expression shifting between surprise and unease. She folded it neatly and placed it back in the envelope. "Well," she said finally, her tone neutral, "it's a kind gesture." Molly ran over at that moment, her cheeks flushed with excitement. "What's in the basket?" she asked, peering over Ethan's shoulder. Just some bread and honey, Ethan replied, handing her the loaf. Go on, take it to the kitchen. As Molly skipped away, Grace turned to Ethan. I don't want you getting too involved with him, she said firmly. You've done your good deed, and that should be the end of it. Ethan nodded, though he wasn't entirely convinced. There was something about George Wellington that intrigued him, something that felt unfinished, but he didn't want to worry his mother, so he kept his thoughts to himself. That evening, as the family sat down to their modest dinner, the bread and honey felt like a feast. Molly hummed happily as she spread the honey over her slice, and even Grace seemed to relax a little, her usual worry lines softening. But for Ethan, the meal didn't bring the same sense of closure. Instead, it left him with a nagging feeling he couldn't shake. He thought of the way George had looked at him, not just with gratitude, but with something deeper, as if Ethan reminded him of something, or someone, from long ago. As the sun set and the house grew quiet, Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. The words from George's note echoed in his mind. My door is always open to you and your family. What did it mean? And why did it feel like the man's gratitude was only the beginning of something much bigger? Ethan didn't have the answers, but deep down, he knew that his encounter with George Wellington was far from over. He just didn't know how much it would change everything. The days following Ethan's return from the mansion were quiet, yet his mind was anything but. The note from George Wellington sat tucked away in a drawer in the small kitchen, but its words echoed in his thoughts. Grace's insistence that they leave things as they were only deepened Ethan's curiosity. Why was she so wary of George? And why had George seemed to look at him with such a peculiar intensity? One morning, as Ethan finished his usual chores, Molly tugged at his sleeve. Can we go to the meadow today? She asked, her doll clutched under her arm. You promised we could pick flowers. Ethan hesitated. The meadow had always been their escape, a place where worries seemed to melt away. But now it was also the place where his strange journey with the wallet had begun. Still, he nodded. All right, Molly, let's go. The meadow was alive with the hum of insects and the gentle rustle of the wind through the tall grass. Molly darted ahead, her giggles blending with the melody of nature, while Ethan trailed behind, his eyes scanning the horizon. From this spot, he could see the distant silhouette of the Wellington mansion, its grandeur stark against the blue sky. It was a constant reminder of the questions that lingered unanswered. As Molly gathered a bundle of wildflowers, Ethan sat on a rock, lost in thought. His mind drifted back to the moment he had handed George the wallet and the way the man had looked at him, grateful, yes, but also wistful, troubled. Ethan couldn't put his finger on it, but it felt as though George had been holding back something important. Ethan, look! Molly's voice pulled him from his thoughts. She held up a flower crown, her face beaming with pride. It's for you. Ethan chuckled, taking the fragile creation and placing it on his head. How do I look? He asked, striking a dramatic pose. Like a king, Molly declared, clapping her hands. The moment of levity was brief, as Ethan's gaze once again drifted to the mansion. Molly followed his line of sight, her brow furrowing. Do you think the man in the big house is nice? She asked. Ethan shrugged. I think he's different, not what I expected. Molly tilted her head thoughtfully. Maybe you should go back and talk to him. Her suggestion caught Ethan off guard. Why would I do that? Because he said you could, Molly said simply, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Ethan didn't respond, but her words stuck with him as they made their way back home. That evening, while Grace mended a tear in one of Molly's dresses, Ethan worked up the courage to ask a question that had been gnawing at him. Mom, he began cautiously, what do you know about Mr. Wellington? Grace didn't look up from her stitching. Not much, she said curtly, just that he's wealthy and keeps to himself. But why don't people in the village like him? Ethan pressed. Grace paused, the needle hovering in midair. People don't trust what they don't understand, she said finally. And men like him, they live in a different world. It's better to leave them to it. Ethan sensed there was more she wasn't saying, but he knew better than to push. Instead, he turned his attention to the note still tucked away in the drawer. Later that night, while the house was quiet, he slipped it out and read it again, the elegant script sparking a fresh wave of curiosity. The following day, Ethan made up his mind. He would visit George Wellington again, not out of defiance toward his mother, but because the unanswered questions were becoming too much to bear. He had no clear plan, only the hope that George might provide some clarity. As he made his way back up the hill, the air seemed heavier, charged with a sense of anticipation. The path was just as overgrown as before, but this time, Ethan didn't hesitate. When he reached the gate, he rang the bell firmly, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't Marjorie who answered this time, but a young man in a gardener's uniform. His dark hair was tousled and his hands were caked with dirt. He looked at Ethan with a mix of curiosity and suspicion. "What do you want?" "I'm here to see Mr. Wellington," Ethan said, trying to sound confident. The gardener raised an eyebrow. "And who are you?" "Ethan Miller. I brought back his wallet the other day." The man's expression softened slightly. "Oh, you're that boy." He opened the gate just enough for Ethan to slip through. "Come on, then. I'll let him know you're here." As Ethan followed the gardener toward the mansion, his nerves began to settle. Whatever answers George Wellington held, Ethan was ready to find them. Ethan walked through the manicured garden paths, following the young gardener who had introduced himself as Daniel. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the untamed fields of Meadowbrook. Daniel's casual stride belied the grandeur of the estate. To him, this was merely a workplace, but for Ethan, it was a world apart. "You've got guts, kid," Daniel said over his shoulder, breaking the silence. "Most people don't bother coming back after meeting someone like Mr. Wellington." Ethan hesitated. "Why's that?" Daniel smirked. "Let's just say he's not exactly known for his warmth." The words didn't ease Ethan's nerves, but he kept walking, his eyes darting to the towering mansion ahead. As they approached the main entrance, Daniel turned to him. "Wait here. I'll let him know you're here." Ethan nodded, his stomach twisting into knots. Daniel disappeared inside, leaving him standing on the wide stone steps. The weight of the moment pressed down on him. He hadn't told his mother he was coming here, and the thought of her disapproval gnawed at the edges of his resolve. But the questions swirling in his mind demanded answers. Minutes passed before the massive oak door creaked open. This time, it was George Wellington himself who stood on the threshold. Dressed in a tailored grey suit, he seemed less imposing than before, though his sharp blue eyes remained as piercing as ever. "Ethan," George said, a note of surprise in his voice. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon." Ethan swallowed his nerves and stepped forward. I wanted to thank you for the gift." "And the note," he added, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. George studied him for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in." Ethan hesitated briefly, then crossed the threshold. The grand foyer was as awe-inspiring as he remembered, with its gleaming marble floors and glittering chandelier. George led him down a different corridor this time, one lined with bookshelves that reached the ceiling. They entered a cozy study, its walls lined with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the room. George gestured for Ethan to sit in one of the plush chairs near the fireplace. "I appreciate your gratitude," George began, settling into a chair opposite Ethan. "But something tells me that's not the only reason you've come." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, feeling the full weight of George's gaze. "I've been thinking a lot since I came here," he admitted. "About you and the wallet and what you said in your note." George raised an eyebrow. "Go on." Ethan hesitated, unsure how to phrase his thoughts. "You said your door is always open to me and my family. But why? You don't even know us." For a moment, George's expression softened, a flicker of something almost vulnerable passing through his eyes. He leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered his response. "You remind me of someone I knew a long time ago," George said finally, his voice quieter than before. "Someone who made a choice similar to yours, a choice that changed everything." Ethan frowned, confused. "Who?" George shook his head. "That's a story for another time. What matters now is that you've shown me something I thought I'd lost sight of. Honesty, integrity, courage. Those qualities are rare, Ethan. They deserve to be nurtured." Ethan's cheeks flushed at the praise, but his curiosity only deepened. "But why my family? Why would you want to help us?" George's eyes darkened slightly, as if weighed down by a secret. "Because I believe in paying debts," he said cryptically, "and because sometimes doing what's right means helping others find their way." Before Ethan could press further, Daniel appeared at the doorway. "Sorry to interrupt, sir, but Marjorie needs a word." George sighed, rising from his chair. "Duty calls," he said, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Wait here, Ethan. I'll be back shortly." As George left the room, Ethan sat back in the chair, his mind racing. He felt as though he were on the edge of understanding something important, but the pieces of the puzzle still didn't fit together. While waiting, Ethan's eyes wandered to the shelves of books. One title caught his attention: The Wellington Legacy. He pulled it down and flipped through the pages, discovering a history of the Wellington family. The book was filled with photographs, some faded with age. One image in particular made him pause: a younger George, standing beside a woman with a striking resemblance to Grace. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. What did this mean? And why hadn't his mother ever mentioned any connection to the Wellingtons? As the door creaked open again, Ethan quickly closed the book and set it back on the shelf. George re-entered, his expression unreadable. "Sorry for the interruption," George said, retaking his seat. "Now, where were we?" Ethan met his gaze, the questions burning in his mind louder than ever, but for now, he kept them to himself, unsure of how much to reveal. As Ethan descended the hill back to Meadowbrook later that afternoon, his mind was buzzing with unanswered questions. The photo he'd seen in The Wellington Legacy lingered vividly in his thoughts. A woman who looked so much like Grace. Was it a coincidence, or was there something more? He knew better than to ask his mother directly, especially after her warnings about George, but he couldn't ignore the feeling that he was stumbling into a story far bigger than himself. The next morning, life in the village resumed its usual rhythm. Ethan helped Mr. Henry at the bakery, earning a few coins and more than a few curious glances from the villagers. Word of his visit to the mansion had spread, thanks to Mrs. Doris's sharp tongue. The villagers whispered about what business Ethan could have with George Wellington, and though no one approached him outright, their sidelong glances were hard to miss. "Don't pay them any mind," Mr. Henry said as he handed Ethan a warm loaf of bread. "People here don't like what they can't understand. They've been talking about that mansion for years, and none of it's ever amounted to much." Ethan nodded, appreciating the baker's kindness, but the weight of the villagers' judgment still clung to him as he walked home. He decided to avoid the main road and instead took a winding path that led through the meadows, where he could think in peace. The meadow's familiar tranquility calmed him, but only slightly. His thoughts kept returning to the photo and George's cryptic words about debts and honesty. As he wandered further into the fields, he came upon a small stone bridge that spanned a narrow creek. It was a place he and Molly often played as children, but today It felt different, quiet, almost solemn. Ethan sat on the edge of the bridge, dangling his feet over the water. Pulling a small stone from his pocket, he rolled it between his fingers, his mind churning. He thought of George's offer, of his mother's caution, and of the look in her eyes whenever the Wellingtons were mentioned. There was a history here, a connection he didn't yet understand, but he was determined to uncover it. "Penny for your thoughts?" The voice startled Ethan, and he turned to see Daniel, the gardener, leaning casually against a tree nearby. His hands were covered in dirt, and a playful smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Didn't mean to scare you," Daniel said, stepping closer. "Just saw you sitting here looking like you'd seen a ghost." Ethan shrugged, embarrassed. "I was just thinking." "About Mr. Wellington," Daniel guessed, sitting down beside him on the bridge. "He has that effect on people." Ethan glanced at him, surprised. "You know him pretty well, then?" Daniel snorted. "As well as anyone can know a man like that. He keeps his cards close to his chest, even with the people who work for him. But I can tell you this, whatever you think you know about him, there's probably more to the story." Ethan hesitated, then decided to take a chance. "Do you know anything about my family?" he asked. "About how we might be connected to Mr. Wellington?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, his expression sharpening. "Now that's an interesting question," he said slowly. "Why do you ask?" Ethan explained what he'd seen in the book, carefully leaving out his mother's warnings and his own suspicions. Daniel listened intently, his brow furrowing as Ethan described the photograph. "I'm not sure what to tell you," Daniel said after a moment, "but if there's one thing I've learned working for Mr. Wellington, it's that he doesn't do anything by accident. If he's taken an interest in you, there's a reason for it." Ethan nodded, though Daniel's words didn't exactly comfort him. "Do you think I should ask him about the photo?" Daniel considered this for a moment. "Depends on how much you want to know," he said. "Sometimes the truth can be complicated." Ethan sighed, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I just want answers. Everyone keeps acting like there's some big secret, but no one will tell me what it is." Daniel clapped him on the shoulder, a gesture somewhere between encouragement and caution. "Then I guess it's up to you to find out," he said, standing. "But be careful, kid. Curiosity's a double-edged sword." As Daniel walked away, Ethan remained on the bridge, staring into the rippling water below. The gardener's words echoed in his mind, mingling with his own doubts and fears. He knew he couldn't ignore the questions any longer, but the idea of confronting George, or worse, his mother, filled him with unease. When he finally rose to leave, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the meadow. The path ahead felt uncertain, but Ethan's resolve was growing stronger. Whatever the truth was, he was determined to find it, even if it meant stepping further into the unknown. The next morning, Ethan woke early, a restlessness in his chest propelling him out of bed before the sun had fully risen. He couldn't shake the feeling that every step he took brought him closer to something monumental, though the destination remained shrouded in mystery. As Grace bustled around the kitchen preparing breakfast, Ethan avoided her eyes, sensing the unease she still carried about George Wellington and their recent connection. After finishing his chores, Ethan set off once again toward the hill, this time with a clearer purpose. The villagers' whispers were background noise now. His focus was fixed on understanding the threads tying his family to the Wellingtons. As he climbed the familiar path to the mansion, the sprawling estate loomed larger than ever, its windows glinting like watchful eyes in the morning light. At the gate, Daniel was waiting, leaning casually against the iron bars with a bemused expression. "Back so soon," he called out, unlocking the gate with a practiced ease. "You're either brave or crazy, kid." "Maybe both," Ethan replied, managing a small smile as he stepped through. Daniel led him around the side of the mansion this time, through a maze of neatly trimmed hedges and flower beds that seemed almost too perfect to be real. The garden stretched far beyond what Ethan had imagined, with fountains, statues, and even a small greenhouse tucked into a corner. It was a world unlike anything he'd known, both beautiful and intimidating. "Wait here," Daniel instructed, gesturing toward a stone bench beneath a towering oak tree. "I'll let him know you're here." Ethan sat down, taking in his surroundings. The air was cool and fragrant, filled with the hum of bees and the distant chirping of birds. For a moment, he allowed himself to relax, letting the tranquility of the garden wash over him. But his calm was short-lived, interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. George Wellington appeared, his presence as commanding as ever despite his casual attire. He carried a cane this time, though he didn't seem to rely on it much. "Ethan," he greeted, his tone less formal than before. "I wasn't expecting you." Ethan stood, shifting his weight awkwardly. "I had some questions," he admitted, "about everything." George studied him for a moment before nodding. "Let's walk," he said, gesturing for Ethan to follow. They strolled through the garden, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the only sound for a while. Ethan tried to work up the courage to speak, but George was the first to break the silence. "You remind me of someone," he said, his voice thoughtful. "Someone who used to walk these gardens with me many years ago." Ethan's curiosity flared. "Who?" George's expression darkened slightly. "A woman who was very important to me," he said. "But that's a story for another time." Ethan frowned, frustration bubbling beneath his surface. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" he blurted out. "Why can't anyone just tell me the truth?" George stopped walking and turned to face him, his piercing blue eyes meeting Ethan's. "Because the truth isn't always simple," he said, "and sometimes it comes with consequences you're not ready for." Ethan held his gaze, refusing to back down. "I think I'm ready." For a moment, George looked as though he might argue, but then he sighed, his shoulders sagging slightly. "Perhaps you are," he said, "but there are others involved, people who might not feel the same." "Do you mean my mum?" Ethan asked, the words slipping out before he could stop them. George's expression didn't change, but Ethan thought he saw a flicker of something, recognition maybe, in his eyes. "Grace is a strong woman," George said carefully. "She's protected you and your sister through more than you know. If she's hesitant, it's because she has her reasons." Ethan's frustration grew, but he forced himself to stay calm. "If you care about her, about us, then why won't you just tell me what's going on?" George didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward a small stone gazebo at the edge of the garden. "Come with me," he said. Ethan followed, his heart pounding as they stepped into the gazebo. Inside, George pulled a leather-bound book from a hidden compartment in one of the stone columns. He held it out to Ethan, his expression solemn. "This might help you understand," George said, "but be careful. What you learn might change the way you see everything and everyone." Ethan hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he took the book, its cover cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. "Thank you," he said quietly, though he wasn't sure whether to feel grateful or afraid. George nodded. "Take your time with it, and if you have more questions, you know where to find me." Ethan left the mansion feeling both empowered and overwhelmed. The book in his hands felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of generations. As he made his way back to the village, he wondered if he was truly ready to uncover the secrets it held, or if he was about to open a door that couldn't be closed. Ethan spent the evening locked in his small room, the book George had given him resting on his lap like a fragile treasure. The leather cover was worn but well kept, the corners rounded from years of handling. Its title, Memoirs of the Wellington Line, was embossed in gold lettering, hinting at a story both personal and grand. He ran his fingers over the letters, the weight of George's words echoing in his mind. What you learn might change the way you see everything and everyone. He opened the book cautiously, its pages exuding a faint, musty smell. The early chapters chronicled the Wellington family's rise to wealth, detailing the investments and business ventures that had built their empire. But as Ethan flipped through the pages, the dry history gave way to more personal accounts, marriages, births, and eventually, secrets. It wasn't until halfway through the book that Ethan stumbled upon something that made his heart race. A photograph slipped between the pages showed a much younger George standing beside a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to Grace. Beneath the photo, a handwritten note read, G. Wellington and E. Hayes, 1984. Hayes, Ethan whispered, his pulse quickening, his mother's maiden name. Was this the connection he'd been searching for? The door creaked open, and Molly peeked in, her doll tucked under one arm. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice full of curiosity. Ethan hesitated, then motioned for her to come in. "Close the door," he whispered. Molly climbed onto the bed beside him, her wide eyes scanning the book. "What's that?" "It's about the Wellington family," Ethan said, deciding not to mention the photograph just yet. "I'm trying to figure something out." Molly tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. "Is it about why Mr. Wellington likes you so much?" Ethan chuckled softly, but her question struck a nerve. "Maybe." Molly traced the edge of the photograph with her finger, her innocent curiosity giving Ethan an idea. If he couldn't find answers in the book alone, perhaps there were others who could help fill in the gaps. The next day, Ethan set out to find Daniel. The gardener seemed to know more about the Wellingtons than he let on, and Ethan was determined to pry loose any information he could. He found Daniel tending to a flower bed near the greenhouse, his hands caked with soil as he hummed a tune under his breath. "Back again, are we?" Daniel said without looking up. "You're becoming a regular visitor." Ethan hesitated, clutching the book tightly under his arm. "I need your help." Daniel glanced up, his brow furrowing when he saw the book. "Where'd you get that?" "Mr. Wellington gave it to me," Ethan said. "I think it has something to do with my family, but I don't understand everything." Daniel wiped his hands on a cloth and stood, his expression shifting from curiosity to concern. "Let me guess, you found something in there that's making you ask questions." Ethan nodded, opening the book to the photograph. "This woman, she looks like my mom. Do you know who she is?" Daniel studied the photo, his lips pressing into a thin line. "That's Elizabeth Hayes," he said finally. "She worked here as a maid a long time ago." Ethan's heart skipped a beat. "Did she know Mr. Wellington?" Daniel hesitated, then nodded. "More than just know him. They were close." Ethan's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together. But before he could ask more, Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. "Listen, kid, if you're digging into this, you need to be careful. Not everyone's going to be happy about you stirring up the past." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice edged with worry. Daniel glanced around as if making sure they weren't being overheard. "There are things about this family that people don't talk about, things that could hurt people if they came out." Ethan tightened his grip on the book, his determination solidifying. "I need to know the truth." Daniel sighed, a mix of resignation and admiration flickering in his eyes. "Then you'd better find Marjorie. She's been here longer than anyone. If anyone knows the whole story, it's her." That evening, Ethan made his way to the mansion once again. Marjorie greeted him at the door, her usual stern demeanor softening slightly when she saw him. "Back already?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "I need to talk to you," Ethan said, his voice steady. "It's about the Wellingtons. And my family. Marjorie's sharp eyes narrowed, but she stepped aside to let him in. "Follow me," she said briskly. She led him to the kitchen, a warm and bustling space that contrasted sharply with the cold grandeur of the rest of the mansion. As she set a kettle on the stove, Ethan placed the book on the table, opening it to the photograph. "Who is she?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Marjorie stared at the photograph for a long moment, her expression unreadable. When she finally spoke, her voice was laced with both sadness and caution. "Elizabeth Hayes was a kind soul," she said. "She worked here for years, and everyone loved her. But her story with Mr. Wellington, it didn't end the way it should have." "What happened?" Ethan pressed, leaning forward. Marjorie hesitated, then looked him square in the eye. "That's not my story to tell, boy, but if you're looking for answers, you're on the right path." Ethan nodded, his resolve only strengthening. He was getting closer to the truth. He could feel it, but the closer he got, the more he realized how much there was still to uncover. The mansion loomed in the fading light as Ethan left the kitchen, Marjorie's words echoing in his mind. Her story with Mr. Wellington, it didn't end the way it should have. What did she mean by that? Every step deeper into the Wellingtons' world seemed to uncover more questions than answers. As he walked down the corridor toward the main hall, the sound of raised voices stopped him in his tracks. He crept closer, pressing himself against the cool marble wall to avoid detection. The voices grew clearer, their tones tense and sharp. "I told you this would happen," Marjorie's unmistakable voice snapped. "The boy's curiosity will only bring more trouble." "And what would you have me do?" George Wellington's deep baritone replied. "Turn him away. Pretend he doesn't exist." Marjorie's voice softened but remained firm. "He deserves the truth, but on your terms. You've let this fester too long, George. The longer you wait, the worse it will be." Ethan's heart pounded as he leaned closer. Were they talking about him? What truth was George hiding, and why did it matter so much? Before he could process what he was hearing, a hand clamped down on his shoulder. Ethan spun around to find Daniel standing behind him, his expression a mix of annoyance and concern. "Eavesdropping, huh?" Daniel whispered. "Not the best way to get answers." Ethan's cheeks flushed, but he stood his ground. "I need to know what they're talking about." Daniel sighed, glancing toward the doorway where the voices continued. "Come on," he said, tugging Ethan away. "You're not going to get anything out of them like this." Reluctantly, Ethan followed Daniel down a side corridor that led to the garden. The cool evening air was a welcome relief after the mansion's stifling tension. Daniel leaned against a stone bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Look, kid," Daniel began, his voice low. "You're poking around in things that have been buried for a long time. People have tried to leave it all behind, and now you're stirring it up." "Because I have to," Ethan insisted, his voice steady despite the knot in his stomach. "This isn't just about the Wellingtons. It's about my family, too." Daniel studied him for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Fair enough, but if you're going to keep digging, you need to be prepared for what you'll find. It's not all pretty." Ethan nodded, his resolve unwavering. "Do you know what happened between my mom and Mr. Wellington?" Daniel hesitated, his hands fidgeting with a loose thread on his sleeve. "I know bits and pieces. Your mom, Elizabeth Hayes, as she was known back then, worked here before you were born. She and Mr. Wellington were close. But something happened and she left. No one talks about it. And George, well, he's not exactly the sharing type." Ethan frowned, frustration bubbling to the surface. "But why wouldn't my mom tell me any of this? Why keep it a secret?" Daniel shrugged. "Maybe she thought it was better that way, or maybe she was protecting you." "From what?" Ethan demanded. Before Daniel could answer, the sound of footsteps approached. Both of them turned to see George standing at the edge of the garden, his expression unreadable. He was silent for a moment, his piercing blue eyes flicking between Ethan and Daniel. "Ethan," George said finally, his tone firm but not unkind. "We need to talk." Daniel glanced at Ethan, his brows knitting with concern, but he stepped aside. "I'll leave you two to it," he muttered, disappearing into the shadows. Ethan squared his shoulders as George stepped closer. "I heard you talking to Marjorie," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "I know there's something you're not telling me." George's jaw tightened, and he gestured toward a nearby bench. "Sit," he said, reluctantly. Ethan obeyed, his heart pounding. George sat beside him, the weight of the moment pressing heavily on both of them. "You're right," George began, his voice quieter now. "There are things I haven't told you, things I haven't told anyone. And for good reason." Ethan waited, his hands clenched into fists as he braced himself for whatever was coming. "Your mother and I—" George hesitated, his gaze distant. "We were close, once. Closer than most would have approved of. But circumstances forced us apart, and she left without a word. I didn't even know she had a child." Ethan's breath caught in his throat. "You're saying you didn't know about me, about Molly?" George shook his head, his expression pained. "Not until recently. When I saw you that day returning my wallet, something about you seemed familiar. It wasn't until I spoke to Marjorie that I realized who you might be." Ethan's mind raced, struggling to process the revelation. Why wouldn't she tell you? Why would she keep this from you and from me? George sighed heavily, his shoulders slumping. "Because she believed it was the only way to protect you. From me, from my name, from the life I lead. She didn't want you to grow up in my shadow." Ethan stared at him, a mixture of anger and confusion boiling inside him. "So what now?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What am I supposed to do with this?" George met his gaze, his expression both earnest and regretful. "That's up to you, Ethan, but I promise you this, I'll do whatever it takes to make up for the time we've lost." Ethan didn't reply. His world had been turned upside down, and the path ahead felt more uncertain than ever. Ethan walked down the hill from the mansion, his head spinning with George's revelation. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the village, but Ethan felt like he was in a different world entirely. His thoughts were heavy with questions. Why had Grace hidden the truth for so long? Why had George waited until now to confront it? And most pressing of all, what did this mean for Ethan and his family's future? When Ethan arrived home, he found Grace at the kitchen table, her sewing untouched. She looked up sharply when he entered, her expression a mix of relief and worry. "Where were you?" she asked, her voice taut. Ethan hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "I was at the Wellingtons again," he admitted, watching her face carefully. Grace stiffened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Ethan, I thought I told you. You didn't tell me anything," Ethan interrupted, surprising even himself with the force of his words. "You've been keeping secrets from me, from all of us." Grace's eyes widened in shock, and for a moment the only sound in the room was Molly humming softly in the corner as she played with her doll. Ethan lowered his voice, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I know about you and George," he said. "I know about your time at the mansion. Why didn't you ever tell me?" Grace's face drained of color, and she sank back into her chair, her hands trembling slightly. "Ethan," she began, but her voice faltered. She looked away, as if searching for the right words in the empty air. "Why, Mum?" Ethan pressed, his voice cracking. "Why did you keep it a secret? Why did you never tell me who he is?" Grace drew a deep, shaky breath and finally met his gaze. "Because I was trying to protect you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "George, his world isn't like ours. It's full of expectations, obligations, and people who would see you as nothing more than an extension of his name. I didn't want that for you." Ethan shook his head, anger and confusion swirling in his chest. "But he's my—" He stopped, the word catching in his throat. "He's my family." Grace's eyes filled with tears. "I know," she said, her voice breaking, "and I thought I was doing the right thing by keeping you away from him, but maybe I was wrong." The room fell silent, the weight of her admission hanging heavy in the air. Molly, sensing the tension, looked up from her play. "What's wrong?" she asked innocently. Grace forced a smile, wiping her eyes quickly. "Nothing, sweetheart," she said. "Go on and finish your game." Molly hesitated, then returned to her doll, her humming quieter now. Grace turned back to Ethan, her expression somber. "You have every right to be angry," she said, "but please understand, I did what I thought was best for you and Molly." Ethan wanted to argue, to demand more answers, but the pain in his mother's voice stopped him. He sat down across from her, his anger softening into a weary confusion. "So what happens now?" he asked quietly. Grace shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I do know this. Whatever you decide to do, I'll support you. You deserve to make your own choices about your life and your future." Ethan nodded, though his thoughts were far from settled. The truth was a heavy burden, and he wasn't sure how to carry it, or where it would lead him. Later that evening, Ethan lay awake in bed, the events of the day replaying in his mind. He thought of George's regretful expression, of Grace's tearful confession, and of the way the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. But there was still so much he didn't know, so much he needed to understand. The next morning, Ethan set out for the mansion again, this time with a clearer purpose. If he was going to navigate this new reality, he needed answers, not just from George, but from Marjorie and even Daniel. Each of them held a part of the story, and Ethan was determined to piece it together. When he arrived at the gate, Daniel greeted him with a knowing smirk. "Back already?" he asked, unlocking the gate. "You're persistent, I'll give you that." Ethan didn't bother with small talk. "I need to see Marjorie," he said. "She knows more than she's telling." Daniel raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "She's in the kitchen," he said, stepping aside. "Good luck." Ethan found Marjorie chopping vegetables at the long wooden counter, her movements precise and efficient. She glanced up when he entered, her sharp eyes narrowing slightly. "What do you want now?" she asked, though her tone lacked its usual bite. "The truth," Ethan said simply. "All of it." Marjorie set down her knife and wiped her hands on a towel, regarding him with a mixture of exasperation and respect. "You're a stubborn one, I'll give you that," she said. "But if you want the truth, you'd better be ready for it." Ethan met her gaze, his resolve unwavering. "I am." Marjorie sighed, leaning against the counter. "All right then," she said. "But once I tell you, there's no going back." Ethan nodded, bracing himself. Whatever came next, he knew it would change everything. Marjorie studied Ethan for a long moment, her sharp eyes seeming to weigh his resolve. Finally, she gestured to a chair at the large wooden kitchen table. "Sit," she said simply. Ethan obeyed, his heart pounding. He watched as she poured 2 cups of tea, her movements deliberate, almost ritualistic. She placed one in front of him before settling into the chair across the table. For a moment, she said nothing, staring into the amber liquid as if the story were etched there. "This is a story I've kept to myself for a long time," she began, her voice quieter than usual. "Not because I wanted to, but because I had to, for your mother's sake and yours." Ethan leaned forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table. "What happened?" Marjorie sighed deeply, as if exhaling the weight of decades. "Your mother, Elizabeth Hayes, came here when she was just a young woman, not much older than you are now. She was bright, kind, hard-working. Everyone in the household admired her, but it was clear from the start that Mr. Wellington admired her most of all. Ethan's pulse quickened as Marjorie continued. At first, it was innocent. She would bring him his tea and they'd talk. She had a way of making even the most stoic people feel at ease, and George was no exception. Over time, their connection deepened. It wasn't just admiration. It was love. But it was a love they couldn't have. Why not? Ethan asked, though he already suspected the answer. Because George was a Wellington, Marjorie said, her tone bitter. And in those days, the Wellingtons didn't marry maids. It didn't matter how much they cared for each other. The family would never have allowed it. Ethan's chest tightened, so they just ended it. Marjorie shook her head. Not exactly. They tried to keep their relationship a secret, but in a house like this, secrets don't stay hidden for long. When the family found out, they gave George an ultimatum: end it or lose everything. And your mother, well, she made the choice for him. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She left, Marjorie said simply. One day, she packed her things and disappeared. She never told George she was leaving, and she never told him why. It broke his heart, but he never stopped caring for her. Ethan sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. But why didn't she tell him about me, or about Molly? Marjorie hesitated, her gaze softening. Because she thought it was the only way to protect you. She didn't want you growing up in a world where people judged you for who your father was, or wasn't. She thought she was doing the right thing. Ethan's thoughts raced, anger and confusion swirling together. He couldn't decide who he was angrier with, his mother for keeping the truth from him, or George for not fighting harder to be a part of their lives. Does he know everything now? Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Marjorie nodded. He does. And believe me, he's carrying the weight of it. He blames himself for everything, for losing your mother, for not being there for you. He's trying to make amends, but it's not an easy road. Ethan stared at the tea in front of him, his reflection rippling in the cup. Why are you telling me this now? Because you deserve to know, Marjorie said firmly. And because I think you're strong enough to handle it. Your mother tried to protect you by keeping the truth hidden, but sometimes the only way to move forward is to face the past. Ethan nodded slowly, his resolve hardening. What should I do? Marjorie gave him a sad smile. That's up to you, Ethan. But whatever you decide, do it with an open heart. Anger and resentment will only hold you back. Ethan left the kitchen feeling both enlightened and burdened. The truth was heavier than he'd imagined, but it also brought clarity. His mother had acted out of love, even if her choices had caused pain. George's regret was genuine, but it couldn't erase the years they'd lost. As Ethan stepped into the garden, he spotted Daniel trimming a hedge nearby. The gardener looked up and raised an eyebrow. You look like you've seen a ghost, he said. I think I just heard one, Ethan replied, his voice hollow. Daniel set down his shears and walked over, concern etched on his face. Marjorie told you, didn't she? Ethan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. About my mom and Mr. Wellington. About everything. Daniel sighed, resting a hand on Ethan's shoulder. It's a lot to take in. You okay? Ethan shrugged, unsure of how to answer. I don't know. I guess I'm just trying to figure out what to do next. Daniel gave him a thoughtful look. Whatever you do, don't let the past define you. Learn from it, but don't let it control you. Ethan nodded, grateful for the advice. As he made his way back to the village, he felt a new sense of purpose. The truth had been hidden for too long, but now that it was out, it was time to decide what to do with it. The truth weighed heavily on Ethan, as he made his way back to the village. The cool evening air did little to calm his racing thoughts, and by the time he reached the familiar site of their modest house, his resolve had hardened. He needed to confront Grace again, not with anger, but with a demand for honesty. There was no moving forward without it. Inside, the house was quiet except for the rhythmic clicking of Grace's sewing machine. Molly had already gone to bed, her doll tucked under one arm as she mumbled softly in her sleep. Ethan stood in the doorway of the kitchen, watching his mother work. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements mechanical, but there was a weariness in her posture that made his heart ache. "Mom," he said softly, breaking the silence. Grace looked up, startled, and her eyes immediately went to his face. Whatever she saw there made her expression tighten. "Ethan," she said cautiously, "what is it?" Ethan stepped into the room and sat down across from her. For a moment, he didn't speak, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he placed the book Marjorie had given him on the table, turning it so Grace could see the photograph of her younger self with George. Her breath hitched, and her hand flew to her mouth. "Where did you get this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "From George," Ethan replied, "and from Marjorie. They told me everything." Grace closed her eyes, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had finally pressed down on her. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears. "I was going to tell you," she said, her voice barely audible. "Someday." Ethan's hands tightened into fists, not with anger, but with frustration. "Why not before now? Why did you keep it from me my whole life?" Grace reached across the table, her hand trembling as she placed it over his. "Because I was scared," she admitted. "Scared of what it would mean for you and Molly. Scared of how it would change the way you saw me." "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom," Ethan said, his voice cracking. "I can handle the truth." Grace's tears spilled over, and she nodded slowly. "You're right. You deserve to know everything." The story she told him was raw and painful, but it filled in the gaps Marjorie hadn't. Grace described her time at the mansion in vivid detail, the joy she'd found in her work, the unexpected friendship with George, and the love that had grown between them despite every obstacle. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "We knew the risks, but we couldn't help ourselves. We thought we could keep it a secret, but we were wrong. When the Wellingtons discovered their relationship, the fallout had been swift and unforgiving. George was given an ultimatum: end things with Grace or lose his place in the family and their fortune. Grace, heartbroken but pragmatic, had made the choice for him. "I couldn't let him throw everything away for me," she said. "It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to the family. So you just left?" Ethan asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and sadness. Grace nodded. "I thought it was the only way. But then, a few months later, I found out I was pregnant with you." Ethan sat back, the enormity of her sacrifice washing over him. "Why didn't you tell him?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you let him be a part of our lives?" Grace's gaze dropped to her lap, her hands twisting together. "Because I was afraid," she said. "Afraid of what his family might do if they found out. Afraid of what kind of life you'd have if you were tied to them. I thought I was protecting you. And now?" Ethan pressed, his voice quieter now. Grace looked up, meeting his gaze. "Now I realize I was wrong. You deserved to know the truth from the beginning, and I robbed you of that. I'm so sorry, Ethan." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, but he swallowed it down. "It's not just me you should be apologizing to," he said. "George deserves to know you're sorry too." Grace nodded, wiping her tears. "You're right, he does." The next day, Ethan and Grace made their way to the mansion together. The walk was silent but heavy with unspoken understanding. When they reached the gate, Daniel greeted them with a look of mild surprise, but didn't question their presence. He led them to the garden, where George was sitting under the shade of an old oak tree, a book in his lap. When he saw them approach, George stood, his expression shifting from surprise to something softer, hopeful, perhaps. "Grace," he said, his voice full of emotion. "Ethan." Grace stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "George," she said, her voice trembling, "I came to apologize." George frowned, shaking his head. "You don't need to." "Yes, I do," Grace interrupted, her voice firm despite her tears. "I made decisions I thought were right at the time, but I see now how much pain they caused. I'm sorry for everything." George was silent for a moment, his gaze steady on hers. Then he stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "We've both made mistakes," he said softly. "But we can't change the past. All we can do is figure out where to go from here." Ethan watched the exchange, a mixture of relief and uncertainty settling in his chest. For the first time, it felt like the wounds of the past might finally begin to heal. But he also knew this was only the beginning of a long and difficult journey. As they sat down together under the oak tree, the sun breaking through the leaves above, Ethan felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to move forward, together. The three of them sat beneath the sprawling oak tree, the tension between Grace and George palpable, despite the soft breeze rustling through the leaves. Ethan watched as his mother and George exchanged glances that spoke volumes, their words struggling to catch up to the unspoken weight of their shared history. George broke the silence first. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice tinged with both gratitude and caution. "I wasn't sure if I'd ever see you again, at least not like this." Grace hesitated, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "It wasn't an easy decision," she admitted. "But Ethan has a way of bringing things to light. I couldn't keep running from the past, not when it's staring us in the face." Ethan glanced between them, his frustration simmering beneath his curiosity. "So where do we go from here?" he asked, his tone cutting through the lingering tension. "You both know the truth now. What happens next?" Grace and George exchanged another look, as though searching for answers in each other's eyes. Finally, George turned to Ethan, his expression solemn. "That depends on what you want," he said. "You've been the one pushing for the truth, Ethan. You deserve to decide how we move forward." Ethan frowned, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. "I don't know what I want," he admitted. I want us to stop pretending like none of this matters." "It does matter," Grace said softly, reaching for Ethan's hand. "More than you know, but figuring out how to move forward, that's not something we can do overnight." Ethan nodded, his frustration giving way to a tentative understanding. Then let's start with the truth," he said, his gaze fixed on George. "Tell me about your life, what it was like after my mom left." George leaned back against the tree, his expression thoughtful. "It wasn't what I expected," he admitted. "I thought I was doing the right thing by staying with my family, keeping the business afloat. But after Grace left..." He paused, his voice catching. "After she left, nothing felt right. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void, but it was always there. I didn't realize just how much I'd lost until I saw you standing at my door." Grace looked down, guilt etched into her features. "I never wanted to hurt you," she said, "but I didn't know what else to do. I thought leaving was the only way to protect all of us." George shook his head, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You always were stubborn," he said, his tone softening. "But I understand now. You were trying to protect Ethan and Molly. I can't fault you for that." Ethan's ears perked up at the mention of Molly. "What about her?" he asked. "Does she have a right to know all of this?" Grace's face paled slightly. "She's still so young," she said. "I don't want to burden her with this yet. She deserves to enjoy her childhood before she has to deal with the weight of our choices." George nodded, though his expression was conflicted. "That's fair," he said. "But when the time comes, I'd like to be part of that conversation. I want her to know who I am and who she is." Ethan leaned back, his mind racing with the implications of their conversation. For years, he had seen his family as small and self-contained, but now their world had expanded in ways he could barely comprehend. He wasn't just Ethan Miller, the boy from Meadowbrook. He was part of something bigger, something more complicated than he'd ever imagined. As the afternoon stretched into evening, the three of them began to talk more freely. George shared stories of his travels, his work, and the challenges of running the Wellington estate. Grace offered glimpses of her life after leaving the mansion, painting a picture of resilience and sacrifice. Ethan listened intently, soaking in every detail as he pieced together the mosaic of their intertwined lives. By the time they stood to leave, the tension between Grace and George had softened into something resembling mutual respect. As they walked back toward the mansion's gate, George paused, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "I want you to know that my door is always open to you," he said, his voice steady. "To both of you." Grace hesitated but eventually nodded. "Thank you," she said, her tone sincere. "We'll figure this out, together." Ethan felt a flicker of hope as they made their way down the hill, the mansion growing smaller behind them. For the first time in weeks, the weight of the truth felt bearable, even if the path ahead remained uncertain. Back at home, Molly greeted them with a bright smile, oblivious to the monumental shift that had occurred. As Grace prepared dinner, Ethan sat with his sister, watching as she carefully arranged her doll's clothes. "Hey, Molly," he said softly, his heart aching with a mix of love and protectiveness. "What would you think if things got a little different around here?" Molly looked up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "Different how?" "Just new people, maybe," Ethan said, fumbling for the right words. "New places to go." Molly shrugged, her smile returning. "As long as we're all together, I don't care," she said simply. Ethan ruffled her hair, her innocent words grounding him in the moment. Whatever the future held, they would face it together. For the first time, Ethan felt a fragile sense of peace, knowing that the truth, no matter how painful, had brought them closer to a new beginning. The morning after their visit to George Wellington's mansion, the Miller household was unusually quiet. Grace sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. Ethan noticed the way her fingers trembled slightly as she stared into the cup, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. Molly was still asleep, her soft snores drifting from the little bedroom she shared with Ethan. Ethan poured himself a cup of water and sat across from his mother. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't the strained kind they'd shared in recent weeks. It was more reflective, as though each was waiting for the other to speak first. "I think we should go back," Ethan said finally, breaking the stillness. Grace looked up sharply, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Back where?" "To see George," Ethan clarified. "There's still a lot we need to figure out, a lot he wants to say, and maybe a lot you need to say too." Grace sighed, her shoulders sagging as she set her mug down. "Ethan, this isn't as simple as just going back and talking," she said. "There are years of choices and mistakes between us. Unpacking all of that won't happen in a single conversation." "I know," Ethan said, his voice steady, "but we've already started, and if we don't keep going, everything we've talked about will just hang there, unfinished." Grace studied him for a long moment, her expression softening. "You're growing up faster than I'd like," she murmured. "And you're right, we can't leave this unfinished." Later that morning, Grace and Ethan walked up the hill to the mansion together. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of autumn. Molly stayed behind with Mrs. Doris, who had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to keep an eye on her for the day. When they arrived, Daniel was waiting at the gate again, his ever-present smirk softening when he saw Grace beside Ethan. "This is becoming a habit," he said, unlocking the gate and swinging it open. "Wellington's in the library. He's been expecting you." The walk through the garden was familiar now, but the mansion's towering presence still left Ethan in awe. They were led into the grand library, where George was seated in a high-backed leather chair, flipping through a thick ledger. He looked up as they entered, his face lighting up in a way that surprised Ethan. "Grace," George said, rising to his feet. "Ethan, I wasn't sure if you'd come back so soon." "We couldn't leave things as they were," Grace said, her tone measured but sincere. "There's still a lot we need to figure out." George nodded, gesturing for them to sit. "I agree," he said, closing the ledger and setting it aside. "I've been thinking a lot about what happens next. About how I can be a part of your lives if you'll let me." Grace glanced at Ethan, then back at George. "What exactly are you offering?" she asked cautiously. George hesitated, his gaze moving between them. "I don't want to overstep," he said finally, "but I want to help, financially, of course, but also emotionally. I know I can't undo the past, but I want to make the future better, for all of us." Ethan felt a flicker of hope, but Grace's expression remained guarded. "It's not that simple," she said. "You can't just throw money at this and expect everything to be okay." "I'm not suggesting that," George said quickly, "but I have resources, opportunities that could help Ethan, Molly, and even you. I want to share them, not as an obligation, but because I care." Grace's shoulders softened slightly, and she looked at Ethan. "What do you think?" Ethan took a deep breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "I think he means it," he said, "and I think we should give him a chance." Over the next few hours, the three of them began to discuss what that chance would look like. George suggested small steps, visiting the mansion more often, involving Ethan and Molly in activities around the estate, and eventually introducing Molly to the truth when the time was right. Grace was hesitant at first, but as the conversation unfolded, she began to see the potential in George's proposals. At one point, George excused himself to retrieve some papers, leaving Ethan and Grace alone in the library. Grace leaned back in her chair, her expression thoughtful. "I never thought I'd be sitting here again," she admitted, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "This place used to feel like a prison to me, but now it's different." "Because he's different," Ethan said quietly, "and I think he's trying." Grace nodded. "I hope you're right." When George returned, he carried a small box, its wood polished to a deep shine. He placed it on the table and opened it carefully, revealing a collection of old photographs, letters, and trinkets. "I thought these might help fill in some of the gaps," he said, pushing the box toward Grace. "They're pieces of our story, of your story." Grace hesitated, her fingers hovering over the box before finally reaching inside. She pulled out a photograph of herself and George, their younger selves smiling brightly in a sunlit garden. "I remember this day," she said softly, a wistful smile crossing her lips. "It was just before everything fell apart." George leaned forward, his voice gentle. "Maybe it's time to rebuild." By the time Grace and Ethan left the mansion, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the path back to Meadowbrook. They walked in companionable silence, the weight of the day's revelations tempered by a growing sense of possibility. As they reached the edge of the village, Grace stopped and turned to Ethan. "Thank you," she said simply. "For what?" Ethan asked. "For pushing me to face this," she said. "I've spent so long running from the past that I forgot how to move forward, but you've given me hope." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet pride. "We'll figure it out," he said. "Together." Grace nodded, and they continued their walk home, the path ahead still uncertain, but illuminated by the promise of a new beginning. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of Molly's laughter drifting through the small house. It was a comforting sound, one that reminded him of the innocence his little sister still carried, an innocence he now felt compelled to protect more than ever. Grace was already awake, standing by the window with a cup of tea in her hands, her gaze distant. "Good morning," Ethan said softly, stepping into the room. Grace turned, her face softening when she saw him. "Morning," she replied. "Did you sleep well?" Ethan shrugged. "As well as I could, I guess. A lot to think about." Grace nodded, her eyes briefly flitting back to the window. "Me too," she admitted. Before Ethan could respond, there was a knock at the door. The sound startled them both. Visitors were rare, especially early in the morning. Grace exchanged a wary glance with Ethan before setting her cup down and moving to answer the door. When she opened it, George Wellington stood on the threshold, his towering figure casting a shadow over the doorway. He was dressed more casually than usual, but the air of authority around him remained unmistakable. "George," Grace said, her tone a mixture of surprise and wariness. "What are you doing here?" "I hope I'm not intruding," George said, his voice calm but earnest. I felt like we left things unfinished yesterday." Ethan stepped forward, curiosity sparking in his chest. "Come in," he said, motioning for George to enter. Grace hesitated, but eventually stepped aside, allowing George to cross the threshold. He glanced around the modest home, his expression unreadable, though Ethan thought he detected a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "This is where you've been all these years," George said quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. "It's humble." "It's home," Grace replied, her tone defensive but not unkind. "And it's been good to us." George nodded, turning his attention to Ethan. "I came to talk to both of you," he said, "but mostly to you, Grace. There are things I've carried for years, things I need to say if we're going to move forward." Grace's jaw tightened, but she gestured toward the kitchen table. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's talk." The three of them sat at the table, the tension in the room palpable. Molly peeked in from the doorway, her doll clutched tightly, but Ethan waved her back toward the bedroom. "Not now, Molly," he said gently. George took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on Grace. "I've spent years wondering what happened," he began. "Why you left so suddenly, without a word. I know now that you thought you were protecting me and Ethan, but it's haunted me all the same." Grace folded her hands on the table, her expression guarded. "I didn't want to leave," she said, "but your family gave me no choice. They made it clear that there was no place for me in your world. I should have fought harder," George said, his voice thick with regret. "I should have walked away from them and chosen you instead." Grace shook her head, a bittersweet smile tugging at her lips. "You couldn't have known, George, and even if you had, would you have been ready to give up everything? Your family, your name, your fortune?" George hesitated, the weight of her words sinking in. "I thought I was doing what was expected of me," he admitted, "but I see now that I was a coward. I let fear dictate my choices, and it cost me everything that truly mattered." Ethan watched the exchange in silence, his emotions a tangled mess. He saw the raw pain in George's expression, the unspoken longing in Grace's, and he realized how deeply their choices had shaped his own life. "I don't want to dwell on the past," Grace said after a moment, her voice soft but firm. "What's done is done, but if we're going to move forward, we need to be honest with each other and with ourselves." George nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. "Agreed," he said. "But honesty doesn't erase the pain I've caused. I want to make amends, not just for the past, but for the future." Grace met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "And how do you plan to do that?" "By being here," George said simply. "For Ethan, for Molly, and for you, if you'll let me. I know I can't undo the years we've lost, but I can be a part of what comes next." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat, his mind racing with the implications of George's words. This wasn't just about reconnecting. It was about rebuilding a family that had been fractured for years. As the conversation continued, the tension began to ease. Grace and George spoke openly, their words tinged with both regret and hope. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every detail as he tried to make sense of the new reality unfolding around him. By the time George stood to leave, the sun was high in the sky, casting a warm light over the small house. He turned to Grace, his expression sincere. "Thank you for listening," he said, "and for giving me a chance to explain." Grace nodded, her lips curving into a faint smile. "It's a start." George's gaze shifted to Ethan, and he placed a hand on his shoulder. "I'll be back soon," he said. "There's more we need to talk about." Ethan nodded, his voice steady. "I'll be here." As George stepped out into the sunlight, Ethan felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like they were walking it together. The house felt still after George left, as though the air itself had settled in the wake of his presence. Grace lingered at the kitchen table, her gaze distant as she turned the now empty mug of tea in her hands. Ethan sat across from her, his mind racing with everything that had been said. "You okay?" Ethan asked softly, breaking the silence. Grace looked up, startled, as though she'd forgotten he was there. "I'm not sure," she admitted. "It's a lot to take in," Ethan nodded, understanding all too well. "Do you believe him about wanting to be part of our lives?" Grace hesitated, her brow furrowing. "I think he means it," she said slowly. "But meaning it and following through are two different things. I've learned that the hard way." Ethan studied her, noticing the lines of worry etched into her face. "I think we should give him a chance," he said after a moment. "If he's serious about this, about being here for us, I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Grace smiled faintly, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "You're a good boy, Ethan," she said. "Too good for someone like me." "Don't say that," Ethan replied, his voice firm. "You did what you thought was right, and maybe it wasn't perfect, but it got us here. That counts for something." Grace's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away. "I just want what's best for you and Molly," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted. And maybe this is what's best," Ethan said. "Giving him a chance, letting him prove that he can be the person he says he wants to be." Grace nodded, though her expression remained conflicted. "We'll see," she said, "one step at a time." The afternoon passed quietly, with Grace retreating to her sewing while Ethan took Molly to the meadow. The little girl chattered happily as she ran through the wildflowers, her laughter ringing out like a song. Ethan followed at a slower pace, his thoughts heavy despite the beauty of the day. "Ethan, look!" Molly called, holding up a crown of daisies she'd woven together. She ran to him, placing it on his head with a giggle. "You're the king of the meadow now." Ethan smiled, crouching to her level. "And you're my princess," he said, placing a smaller crown on her head. "The best princess there ever was." Molly beamed, her eyes shining with joy. "Do you think we'll ever get to see the big house again?" she asked suddenly, her tone casual but curious. Ethan hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "Why do you ask?" "Because it was so pretty," Molly said, twirling in the sunlight. "And the man there was nice. I liked him." Ethan felt a pang in his chest, his sister's innocent words striking deeper than she could have known. "Maybe we will," he said, keeping his voice light. "But only if Mum says it's okay." Molly nodded, satisfied with his answer, and ran off to chase a butterfly, Ethan watched her, the weight of the truth he now carried settling over him like a heavy cloak. Molly didn't know who George really was, or what he could mean for their family, and Ethan wasn't sure how or when she should find out. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned shades of orange and pink, Grace called Ethan into the kitchen. She was holding the small box George had left with them the day before, her expression thoughtful. "I've been looking through these," she said, gesturing to the photographs and letters inside. "It's strange, seeing these pieces of my past after so many years. It feels like looking at someone else's life." Ethan stepped closer, peering into the box. A faded photograph of Grace and George caught his eye, their younger selves smiling brightly at the camera. "You look happy," he said. "We were," Grace admitted, "for a while." She pulled out a letter, the paper yellowed with age. "This one's from George," she said. "He wrote it after I left, but I never opened it. I couldn't. It felt too painful, like admitting I'd made the wrong choice." Ethan frowned. "Are you going to read it now?" Grace hesitated, then nodded. "I think I have to." She unfolded the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly. As her eyes scanned the words, her expression shifted from guarded to something softer, more vulnerable. When she finished, she set the letter down, her gaze distant. "What did it say?" Ethan asked gently. Grace looked at him, a faint smile playing at her lips. "It said he loved me," she said, "that he always would, and that he hoped one day we'd find our way back to each other." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. "Do you think that's still true?" Grace shook her head, her smile turning wistful. "I don't know," she said, "but I think he meant it when he wrote it, and maybe that's enough for now." Ethan nodded, feeling a flicker of hope. For the first time, it felt like the pieces of their fractured family might finally be coming together. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't happen overnight, but it was a start. As Grace returned the letter to the box, she looked at Ethan, her eyes filled with determination. "Whatever happens next," she said, "we'll face it together." Ethan smiled, his heart swelling with a quiet resolve. "Yeah," he said, "together." The following days passed in a curious mix of normalcy and quiet anticipation. Ethan returned to his daily routines, helping Mr. Henry at the bakery, taking Molly to the meadow, and tending to small chores around the house. But beneath the surface of these familiar rhythms, there was a tension, an unspoken awareness that their lives were on the cusp of significant change. Grace, too, seemed different. Though she still busied herself with sewing and keeping the house in order, Ethan noticed a new lightness in her movements. It was as if, by sharing her past, she had lifted a weight she had carried for years. One afternoon, Ethan decided to visit the mansion again, this time alone. He felt a pull toward George, not just as a man seeking to reconcile his past, but as someone who might help Ethan understand what the future could hold. Grace gave her reluctant blessing, her expression softening as Ethan reassured her he would return before dark. When Ethan arrived at the mansion, Daniel greeted him at the gate with his usual smirk. "You're becoming a regular," he said, swinging the gate open. "What's the occasion this time?" "I just want to talk," Ethan replied simply. Daniel nodded, his smirk fading into something more thoughtful. "He's in the library." "You know the way?" Ethan made his way through the familiar halls, his footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. When he reached the library, he found George seated at the large desk, poring over a stack of papers. He looked up as Ethan entered, a smile breaking across his face. "Ethan," George said warmly, setting the papers aside. "This is a pleasant surprise." "I wanted to talk," Ethan said, stepping into the room. "About everything." George gestured for him to sit. "Of course," he said. Where should we start? Ethan hesitated, gathering his thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about wanting to be part of our lives, he began. And I believe you. But I also need to understand who you are, not just as part of my family, but as a person. George leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That's fair, he said. What do you want to know? Everything, Ethan said honestly. What your life has been like, what made you who you are. George smiled faintly. That's a long story, he said, but I suppose we have time. Over the next hour, George shared his story. He spoke of his privileged upbringing, the expectations placed on him from a young age, and the constant pressure to live up to the Wellington name. He described his early years in the business world, the successes and failures that had shaped him, and the regrets that still lingered. It's strange, George admitted, his voice quiet. For so long, I thought I was doing the right thing, building a legacy, preserving the family name, but I see now that I was chasing the wrong things, the things that really matter. I let them slip away. Ethan listened intently, absorbing every word. Do you regret it? He asked. The choices you made, every day, George said without hesitation. But regret doesn't change the past. It only teaches us how to be better in the future. Ethan nodded, the words resonating deeply. I think that's what my mom's been trying to do too, he said. She made mistakes, but she's trying to fix them, and I think she wants to give you a chance. George's expression softened. That means more to me than you know, he said. And I'll do everything I can to earn that chance. As the conversation shifted, George began asking Ethan about his own life, his dreams, his interests, and what he wanted for his future. At first, Ethan hesitated, unsure of how to articulate his thoughts, but as George listened with genuine interest, the words came more easily. I want something more than what we have now, Ethan admitted. Not just for me, but for Molly and my mom too. I want us to have opportunities, to see more of the world. George nodded, his eyes glinting with approval. You have a good head on your shoulders, he said, and a strong heart. Those qualities will take you far. Ethan felt a warmth spread through him at the praise, but there was also a flicker of doubt. But what if it's not enough? He asked. What if I mess it all up? George leaned forward, his gaze steady. The only true failure is not trying, he said. Life will throw challenges at you, but it's how you face them that defines you. And you, Ethan, you've already shown more courage than most people twice your age. Ethan swallowed the lump in his throat, the weight of George's words settling over him. For the first time, he began to see himself not just as a boy from a small village, but as someone capable of shaping his own future. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Ethan stood to leave, his heart lighter than when he had arrived. George walked him to the gate, their conversation trailing into the quiet evening air. Thank you, Ethan said as they reached the gate. For being honest with me, it means a lot. George placed a hand on his shoulder, his expression earnest. Thank you, Ethan, for giving me a chance. Ethan nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. As he made his way back down the hill, he felt a newfound sense of clarity. The journey ahead would not be easy, but for the first time, he felt truly ready to face it. Ethan's steps felt lighter as he made his way back to the village, the conversations with George replaying in his mind. The doubts and frustrations that had weighed him down for weeks were beginning to lift, replaced by a cautious optimism. For the first time, the fractured pieces of his family's story seemed to be falling into place. When he reached the small house, the scent of Grace's cooking greeted him at the door. Molly sat at the table, her hands sticky with jam as she spread it over a piece of bread. She looked up with a bright smile as Ethan entered. You're back, she said cheerfully, holding up her bread. Want some? Ethan chuckled, ruffling her hair. "Not right now, squirt," he said. "But thanks." Grace appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her gaze lingered on Ethan, searching his face for clues. "How did it go?" she asked. "It was good," Ethan replied, his tone honest but measured. "We talked a lot. He told me about his life, about what he regrets and what he hopes for now." Grace nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "And how do you feel about it?" Ethan considered her question for a moment. "I think he's sincere," he said finally. "He's trying to make things right, and I think we should let him." Grace's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "If that's how you feel, then we'll give him that chance," she said. "But remember, Ethan, this isn't just about him. It's about all of us. We need to move forward together." Ethan nodded, a sense of relief washing over him. "I know, Mom. And I think we can." That evening, the Miller family sat together for dinner, the mood lighter than it had been in weeks. Molly chattered about her day, filling the small room with her laughter. Grace seemed more relaxed, the lines of worry on her face softening as she listened to her children. Ethan felt a warmth in his chest, a sense of hope that he hadn't realized he was missing. After dinner, Ethan and Grace sat together at the table while Molly played with her doll in the corner. Grace pulled out the small wooden box George had given her, placing it between them. "I've been thinking about these," she said, gesturing to the photographs and letters inside, "about what they mean and how they connect us to him." Ethan leaned forward, his gaze fixed on the box. "What do you think we should do with them?" Grace hesitated, her fingers brushing over the edge of a faded photograph. "I think we should share them with Molly," she said. "Not everything, not yet, but enough to help her understand that there's more to our family than what she sees now." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and apprehension. "She's going to have questions." "I know," Grace said softly, "and we'll answer them together, little by little, as she's ready." The next day, Ethan accompanied Grace and Molly to the mansion for what felt like a pivotal visit. George greeted them at the door, his expression brightening when he saw Molly clutching her doll. He crouched down to her level, a warm smile on his face. "And who might this be?" George asked, his tone light and friendly. Molly tilted her head, studying him with wide eyes. "I'm Molly," she said. "Who are you?" George chuckled, glancing at Grace for permission. When she gave a small nod, he turned back to Molly. "I'm George," he said. "A friend of your brother and your mom." Molly seemed satisfied with the answer, her face breaking into a grin. "Your house is really big," she said. "Do you get lost in it?" "Sometimes," George admitted, his smile widening. "Maybe you can help me find my way around," Molly giggled, clearly charmed, and Ethan felt a surge of hope. It wasn't a full explanation of who George was, but it was a start. The afternoon was spent in the mansion's garden, where George had arranged for a small picnic under the shade of the old oak tree. Molly ran through the flower beds, her laughter echoing across the grounds, while Grace and George sat on a nearby bench, their conversation quiet but steady. Ethan wandered toward the edge of the garden, his thoughts drifting as he watched the scene unfold. The mansion, once a symbol of mystery and tension, now felt like a place where healing could begin. He glanced back at his mother and George, noting the way their postures had softened. They weren't just two people burdened by their past anymore. They were two people trying to find common ground for the future. "Penny for your thoughts." Daniel's voice broke through Ethan's reverie. Ethan turned to find the gardener leaning against a nearby tree, his ever-present smirk firmly in place. "Just thinking," Ethan replied. "Dangerous habit," Daniel teased. "But you look lighter today, like something's finally clicked." Ethan smiled faintly, "Maybe it has," he said. "I think we're starting to figure it out." Daniel nodded, his smirk softening into something more genuine. Good for you, kid," he said. "It's about time this place saw something other than old ghosts." As the sun dipped low on the horizon, casting the garden in hues of gold and pink, the Miller family prepared to leave. Molly hugged George tightly, her newfound affection for him clear, while Grace offered a small but genuine smile. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything today." George nodded, his gaze steady. "This is just the beginning," he said. "There's still a lot to work through, but we'll get there, together." As they walked back down the hill, Ethan felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but the path felt clearer now. They were no longer defined by the secrets of the past. They were shaping a future built on trust, understanding, and the quiet strength of a family finding its way back to one another. The weeks that followed brought a quiet transformation to the Miller family's life. The visits to George's mansion became a regular occurrence, each one chipping away at the barriers that had once separated them. Grace and George's conversations grew deeper, moving beyond the pain of their past toward the hope of building something meaningful in the present. For Ethan, the change was even more profound. George had taken a particular interest in his education, offering to fund his studies and introducing him to books and ideas Ethan had never encountered before. At first, Ethan had been hesitant to accept such generosity, but George's approach was thoughtful and unassuming. "You've got potential, Ethan," George had said one afternoon in the library. "I want to help you realize it, not because I owe you, but because I believe in you." The words stayed with Ethan, spurring him to push himself further. He began spending evenings studying, poring over books George had lent him. Grace noticed the shift, her pride evident in the way she watched him work. "You're going to do great things," she said one night, her voice filled with quiet confidence. "And so are you," Ethan replied, surprising her. "You've done so much for us, Mom. It's time you let yourself dream a little too," Grace smiled, her eyes glistening. "Maybe," she said softly. "Maybe it's time." Molly, too, thrived in the new dynamic, though she still didn't know the full truth about George. Her bond with him grew naturally. He became a source of gentle guidance in her life, teaching her about the flowers in the garden and telling her stories of his travels. Her laughter filled the mansion on their visits, a sound that seemed to breathe new life into the old walls. One crisp autumn afternoon, George invited the Millers to a small gathering at the mansion. It was a modest event, just a few trusted staff and close acquaintances, but it marked a significant step in George's efforts to include Grace and the children in his world. Grace had been hesitant at first, but Ethan had convinced her it was an opportunity to move forward. The gathering was held in the mansion's grand hall, its high ceilings and ornate chandeliers lending an air of elegance. Ethan noticed how George stayed close to Grace throughout the evening, introducing her to guests with quiet pride. For her part, Grace carried herself with grace and poise, though Ethan could see the nervousness in her eyes. Molly, meanwhile, charmed everyone she met, her natural curiosity and joy drawing smiles from even the sternest faces. Ethan couldn't help but feel a swell of pride watching his family find their place in this unfamiliar but welcoming space. Toward the end of the evening, George pulled Ethan aside, leading him to a quiet corner of the hall. "I wanted to show you something," he said, his tone serious but kind. Ethan followed him to a small alcove where a framed photograph hung on the wall. It was the same photo Ethan had seen in the book weeks ago, George and Grace in their younger days, standing side by side in the mansion's garden. "This was taken not long before everything fell apart," George said, his voice tinged with nostalgia. "It's a reminder of what I lost and what I've been given a chance to regain." Ethan studied the photo, his emotions swirling. "Do you think we can really make it work?" he asked. "After everything," George placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder, his gaze steady. "It won't be easy," he admitted, "but I believe we can. We've already come this far, and with time, I think we can build something strong, something lasting." Ethan nodded, the weight of George's words settling over him. "I want that too," he said quietly. "For all of us." As the Millers walked home that night, the crisp air filled with the scent of fallen leaves, Ethan felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in months. The road ahead was still uncertain, but they were no longer walking it alone. Grace walked beside him, her arm linked with his, while Molly skipped ahead, her laughter ringing out in the quiet night. For the first time, Ethan truly believed they were on the path to something better, a future built not on secrets or regret, but on hope, honesty, and the enduring strength of family. The leaves in Meadowbrook had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, painting the village with the vibrant hues of autumn. The crisp air carried a sense of renewal, mirroring the transformation happening within the Miller family. As the days passed, their bond with George deepened, and the quiet hope that had begun to take root started to flourish. One morning, Grace stood in the kitchen, her hands busy kneading dough for bread. The scent of freshly brewed coffee filled the small room as Molly hummed a tune at the table, carefully coloring in a picture of flowers. Ethan entered, carrying a stack of books George had lent him. "You're up early," Grace remarked, glancing at her son with a smile. "Lots to study," Ethan replied, setting the books down. "George said he wants me to think about what I might want to do after school. He thinks I could get into a good college if I work hard." Grace paused, her hands still in the dough. "And what do you think?" she asked, her tone careful but curious. Ethan hesitated, then smiled. "I think he's right. And I think I'd like to try." Grace's eyes softened, a mixture of pride and emotion shining in them. "Then we'll make it happen," she said firmly. "Whatever it takes." That afternoon, the Millers made their way to the mansion for another visit. The garden, now blanketed in a layer of fallen leaves, felt even more serene in the golden light. Molly ran ahead, her laughter echoing as she chased a squirrel darting between the flower beds. George greeted them warmly at the gate, his expression brightening when he saw Molly. "You've brought the sunshine with you," he said, lifting her into his arms as she giggled. Grace and Ethan followed, their steps slower but no less purposeful. George led them to the gazebo, where a small table had been set with tea and cakes. As they settled into the cozy space, the conversation flowed easily, a stark contrast to the guarded exchanges of weeks past. At one point, George turned to Molly, his tone playful. "Do you know what's special about today?" Molly tilted her head, thinking hard. "Is it someone's birthday?" she guessed. George chuckled. "Not quite, but it is a celebration of sorts. Today marks the beginning of something new for all of us, a fresh start." Molly clapped her hands, delighted by the idea. Grace smiled, though her expression held a trace of reflection. "A fresh start," she repeated softly, as if savoring the words. Ethan looked around the table, feeling a warmth that was deeper than the autumn sun. For the first time, it felt like they truly belonged, not just as visitors to George's world, but as part of it. Later, as the family prepared to leave, George pulled Ethan aside. "There's something I want to show you," he said, leading him into the mansion. They walked through the familiar halls until they reached a room Ethan hadn't seen before. Inside, the walls were lined with photographs and paintings, each one a snapshot of the Wellington family's history. In the center of the room stood a large wooden easel holding a blank canvas. "This," George said, gesturing to the canvas, "is for us, for our family. I want us to create something together, something that tells our story, not just mine." Ethan stared at the canvas, his mind racing with possibilities. "What should we put on it?" he asked. "Anything we want," George said with a smile. "Memories, hopes, dreams. It's a way to remind ourselves of where we've been and where we're going." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat but swallowed it down, nodding. "I'd like that," he said. As they walked home that evening, Ethan shared the idea of the canvas with Grace and Molly. Molly was immediately excited, chattering about all the things she wanted to paint: flowers, stars, and maybe even their little house. Grace listened quietly, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's a beautiful idea," she said, "a way to remind us of how far we've come." Ethan glanced at her, noting the peace in her expression. "It's not just George's story anymore," he said. "It's ours." Grace nodded, her voice steady. "And it's just beginning." As the house came into view, its warm lights glowing against the darkening sky, Ethan felt a sense of completeness he hadn't thought possible. They were a family, a complicated, imperfect family, but a family nonetheless. And together, they were creating something new, something beautiful. The road ahead was still unwritten, but Ethan knew they would face it together, one step at a time. The first chill of winter began to creep into the air, but the warmth inside the Miller household seemed to grow with each passing day. Their visits to George's mansion became a part of their routine, blending the simplicity of their village life with the opportunities George offered. For Ethan, these visits felt like stepping into a new world, one that held the promise of a future he had never dared to imagine. One evening, as the family sat around the small kitchen table, Grace pulled out the wooden box George had given her. Molly looked up from her drawing, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Are those the pictures from the big house?" she asked, tilting her head. Grace nodded, her fingers brushing over the box's lid. "Yes," she said softly. "These are pieces of our family's story." Ethan and Molly leaned in as Grace opened the box, revealing the photographs, letters, and trinkets inside. Molly picked up a small brooch, its delicate design catching the light. "It's so pretty," she said, holding it up. "Who did it belong to?" "It was mine," Grace said, a smile tugging at her lips. "A gift from George a long time ago." Molly's brow furrowed as she studied the brooch. "Why did he give it to you?" Grace hesitated, glancing at Ethan for support. He nodded subtly, encouraging her to continue. "Because we were close," Grace said carefully. "A long time ago, before you and Ethan were born." Molly's eyes widened. "You mean, like friends?" Grace smiled faintly. "Something like that," she said, "but it's a little more complicated." Molly seemed satisfied with the answer for now, turning her attention back to her drawing. Ethan caught Grace's eye and gave her a reassuring smile. It wasn't the full truth, but it was a step toward helping Molly understand their family's evolving story. The next day, George invited the Millers to the mansion for an important discussion. When they arrived, they found him in the library, a large map of Meadowbrook spread across the desk. "What's all this?" Grace asked, her brow furrowing as she took a seat. George gestured to the map, his expression thoughtful. "I've been thinking about the future," he said, "not just for us, but for the village. There's so much potential here, so much we can do to make Meadowbrook a better place." Grace studied the map, her skepticism softening as George explained his ideas. He spoke of revitalizing the local school, creating new opportunities for young people, and supporting small businesses like the bakery where Ethan worked. "And I want all of you to be a part of it," George said, his gaze steady. "This isn't just about my legacy anymore, it's about ours." Ethan felt a surge of pride as he listened to George's plans. It wasn't just words, it was a vision for something greater, something that could benefit everyone in the village. Grace nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "It's ambitious," she said, "but I think it's worth trying." George smiled, a genuine warmth in his eyes. That's all I needed to hear. Later that afternoon, Ethan found himself in the garden with Daniel, helping to rake the last of the fallen leaves. The gardener watched him with a curious expression, leaning on his rake as Ethan worked. "You've changed, kid," Daniel said finally. "You're not the same boy who showed up here with that wallet." Ethan paused, leaning on his rake. "Maybe," he said, "but I think that's a good thing." Daniel grinned. "It is. You've grown into someone who knows what he wants and isn't afraid to go after it." Ethan smiled, the compliment settling over him like a warm blanket. "Thanks, Daniel." The two worked in companionable silence for a while, the crisp air filled with the sound of rustling leaves. For Ethan, the simple act of working in the garden felt like a reminder of how far he had come and how much further he could go. That evening, as the Millers walked home from the mansion, Ethan felt a sense of purpose he hadn't known before. The future still held uncertainties, but for the first time, it felt like they were building something together. A legacy rooted in love, resilience, and hope. As the house came into view, its warm lights glowing against the darkening sky, Ethan glanced at Grace and Molly. They were his anchor, his reason for striving towards something better. And with George now a part of their lives, the possibilities seemed endless. "We're going to be okay," Grace said softly, her voice steady. "All of us." Ethan nodded, his heart swelling with gratitude. "Yeah," he said, "we are." The days grew shorter as winter approached, but within the Miller family, a sense of warmth and renewal blossomed. Their visits to George's mansion became more than routine. They became a foundation for something new and enduring. For the first time in years, Grace allowed herself to hope, not just for her children, but for herself. One crisp morning, George invited them to the mansion's drawing room. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a cozy glow over the space. Molly was already seated on a cushioned chair, eagerly paging through a picture book George had set aside for her. Ethan and Grace sat across from George, the air between them filled with quiet anticipation. "I've been thinking about how to make our connection more tangible," George began, his voice steady but laced with emotion. "It's not enough to simply mend the past. We need to create something lasting for the future." Grace raised an eyebrow, her expression cautious but curious. "What do you have in mind?" George leaned forward, resting his hands on his knees. "I want to create a scholarship fund in Ethan's name," he said. "A way to support not only his education, but also the education of other young people in Meadowbrook who might not have the resources to pursue their dreams." Ethan's breath caught, his heart pounding in his chest. "A scholarship?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. George nodded. "You've shown me what it means to have integrity, resilience, and hope. I want to honor that and to help others find those qualities in themselves." Grace's eyes softened, and she placed a hand over Ethan's. "That's a generous offer," she said, "but are you sure it's something you want to do?" "It's not just something I want to do," George replied, his voice firm. "It's something I need to do, for you, for Ethan and Molly, and for this village." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. He had never imagined his actions, returning that wallet on an ordinary day, would lead to this. "Thank you," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," George said with a smile. "Just keep being who you are." As they left the mansion that afternoon, Ethan and Grace walked side by side, the weight of George's offer settling over them. Molly skipped ahead, her laughter echoing through the crisp air as she chased a flurry of leaves. "Are you okay?" Ethan asked, glancing at his mother. Grace nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the path ahead. "I think so," she said, It's just a lot to take in. I know, Ethan said, but I think it's a good thing. For all of us. Grace smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. You're right, she said. It is. Back at home, Grace began preparing dinner while Ethan helped Molly with her drawing. The little girl was working on a picture of their family, complete with their small house and the mansion on the hill in the background. Do you think we'll always be together? Molly asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Ethan looked at her, his chest tightening. Of course, he said. We're a family. And no matter what happens, we'll always have each other. Molly smiled, satisfied with his answer, and returned to her drawing. Ethan watched her, his heart swelling with a mix of love and determination. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew they would face them together. That evening, after Molly had gone to bed, Grace and Ethan sat by the fire, the warmth of the flames wrapping around them like a comforting embrace. Grace reached for the box of photographs and letters, pulling out a faded picture of herself and George. I never thought we'd come back to this, she said, her voice soft. Ethan leaned closer, studying the picture. Do you regret it, leaving? Grace shook her head. No, she said. I did what I thought was best at the time, but now I see that leaving didn't mean the end. It was just a part of the journey. Ethan nodded, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. Do you think we can really make this work? With George? Grace placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip steady. I think we can, she said. It won't be perfect, and it won't be easy, but it's worth trying. Ethan smiled, the flicker of hope in his chest growing brighter. I think so too. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, mother and son sat together, their bond stronger than ever. The path ahead was still uncertain, but they were no longer walking it alone. They were building a bridge, one step at a time, toward a brighter future. The first snow of the season arrived early in Meadowbrook, blanketing the village in a soft layer of white. For Ethan, the snow seemed symbolic, a clean slate, a fresh beginning. The air carried a quiet stillness, broken only by the crunch of boots on the cobblestone streets and the distant laughter of children building snowmen in the square. At the Miller household, preparations for a special dinner were underway. George had invited the family to the mansion for a festive gathering, a way to mark their progress and set the tone for the future. Grace had hesitated at first, but Ethan had convinced her it was an important step. It's not just about us anymore, Ethan had said. It's about the family we're becoming. Grace had agreed, though her nerves were evident as she fussed over Molly's hair and smoothed the wrinkles in her dress. Ethan, dressed in his best shirt, watched her with a mix of amusement and admiration. You look fine, Mom, he said, grinning. Better than fine, actually. Grace rolled her eyes, but a small smile tugged at her lips. You're just saying that because you want me to relax. Is it working? Ethan teased. A little, Grace admitted, her smile growing. The mansion glowed warmly against the snowy backdrop, its windows alight with the flicker of candles and the soft hum of activity inside. When the Millers arrived, George greeted them at the door, his smile wide and genuine. You made it, he said, his voice filled with warmth. Come in, come in. Molly ran ahead, her eyes wide with wonder as she took in the festive decorations. A grand Christmas tree stood in the center of the drawing room, its branches adorned with glittering ornaments and twinkling lights. George crouched to her level, handing her a small ornament shaped like a star. Would you like to add this to the tree? He asked. Molly nodded enthusiastically, taking the ornament with care. Grace watched the interaction from the doorway, her expression softening. For all her reservations, it was clear that George was making a genuine effort to connect, not just with Ethan, but with all of them. Dinner was a lively affair, filled with laughter and stories. George regaled them with tales of his travels, while Molly entertained the table with her endless curiosity. Grace, though quieter, seemed more at ease than Ethan had seen her in years. It was as if the weight she had carried for so long was finally beginning to lift. After dessert, George rose from his seat, his expression growing more serious. "There's something I'd like to share," he said, drawing the family's attention. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound journal. "This belonged to my father," he said. "He started it as a record of our family's history, and over the years, I've added to it." George opened the journal, flipping through its pages until he found a blank section. "I'd like to add something new tonight," he continued. "A chapter about us, about this new beginning." Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat as George placed the journal on the table. "Each of us will write something," George said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "A memory, a hope, a promise, anything that feels meaningful." Molly clapped her hands, delighted by the idea, while Grace nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. Ethan picked up the pen first, his hand trembling slightly as he put ink to paper. He wrote about the day he found George's wallet, about the unexpected journey it had set in motion, and about the hope he now felt for their family. When he finished, he passed the journal to Grace. She hesitated, her eyes scanning the page Ethan had written before adding her own words. She wrote about sacrifice and resilience, about forgiveness and the courage to face the truth. When she handed the journal back to George, her eyes were glistening with unshed tears. Finally, it was Molly's turn. She drew a picture instead of writing, her small hands carefully sketching their family standing together beneath the mansion's towering oak tree. When she finished, she held it up proudly. "It's us," she said simply. George smiled, placing the journal back in his pocket. "It's perfect," he said. As the evening wound down, the family gathered by the fire in the library. The warmth of the flames wrapped around them like a comforting embrace, and for a moment, the world outside the mansion seemed to disappear. "I want to thank all of you," George said, his voice steady but full of emotion, "for giving me a chance to be part of your lives. It's more than I could have hoped for, and I promise I won't take it for granted." Grace reached for his hand, her touch light but firm. "We're grateful too," she said, "for your patience, your kindness, and your willingness to make this work." Molly climbed into George's lap, resting her head against his chest. "You're part of our family now," she said matter-of-factly, her voice muffled by the fabric of his jacket. George chuckled softly, his eyes misting. "Thank you, Molly," he said. "That means the world to me." Ethan watched the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a quiet joy. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with uncertainty and pain, but they had made it. Together, they had built something new, something stronger than the secrets and regrets of the past. As the first snowflakes of the evening began to drift past the window, Ethan felt a profound sense of peace. The future was still unwritten, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it, with hope, with love, and with the unwavering strength of a family united. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.